Welcome to today's session. I'm Kezzy Moynihan, and we are going to be talking about using critical thinking in the language classroom. Okay, so let's begin with our thoughts on how to use critical thinking in the language classroom. First of all, what is critical thinking? So, a critical thinker is someone who waits for sufficient evidence before forming an opinion. So when they're reading a newspaper article, they're thinking about how reliable, how trustworthy is this article? What's the source? Have I had enough evidence to believe what's being said? They organize and articulate their thoughts well. So when they're learning something new or expressing an opinion, the way they're talking about that and expressing it is organized and comprehensible. They try to think about the possible consequences of an action. So if I do this, what will happen next? If I did this, what would happen next? They're capable of learning independently. They don't rely too much on the teacher or other people to help them understand or acquire new information. And they can select and apply learnt techniques to different situations. So if they learn how to do something in one context, they're able to take that technique and apply it to a variety of other contexts. Importantly, in English language teaching or any language teaching, why does this matter? Why should we teach critical thinking in our classrooms? So let's have a look at some of the ways that critical thinking can help our students. Critical thinking in the classroom can really help encourage more skillful communication. When we communicate with people, we're making choices, we're relating to what they say. And obviously for our students, communication, skillful communication is the ultimate goal of their language learning journey. So by employing critical thinking techniques in the classroom, you're helping to encourage them to do all those things and be a more skillful and comprehensible communicator. It definitely helps people become more independent learners. Obviously, as teachers, one of our goals is to help our students to learn things by themselves. Critical thinkers are able to make more choices and select language and identify their own issues without having to rely on a teacher to feed that information directly to them. And then, of course, it definitely allows people to make better decisions of what language to use in different contexts. So in terms of politeness, they might understand that this language is appropriate in that context, but in another, they're able to make a critical decision and realize that this is not polite enough, this language, for that. In language teaching, of course, critical thinking can as well help learners to identify their own issues without needing teacher intervention. So a student who's got a good sense of criticality about their own skills as a language speaker is able to realize that in this context, perhaps they're not using the right language, or this particular grammar structure is not helping them express the meaning they want to convey. It gives learners a better idea of the culture factors and mentality associated with English or the language that they are learning. So every language has an inherent culture and mentality or perspective attached to it. Learners who are able to think critically can understand that perhaps in this cultural context, that language has a slightly different meaning than in that one. Obviously, English is a very widely spoken language, and many different countries speak it as their first language, and many others use it as a lingua franca. It's important that learners are able to make critical decisions and reflect and understand different ways that language can affect the social implication and reflect their own mentality in that context. So allows learners to better identify similarities and differences between English and their mother tongue. A learner of Chinese might better understand that in their language, tenses and grammar structures are very differently expressed in English, and understanding those differences helps them learn and make better choices with the structures they're going to use. Okay, so how do I teach critical thinking? The most important question. Important things to remember are that critical thinking cannot be developed overnight. It is not a one lesson situation. You cannot do it in one day. It requires careful planning. It's very difficult to create spontaneous critical thinking tasks, especially if you're new to it. So it's important to carefully incorporate it into your lesson plans when you are thinking about what you're going to teach. Also, no right way to teach critical thinking. Different contexts will require different approaches and techniques. So today's session is not about me telling you that you need to do it like this. It is about me giving you some options and ideas to help you think and reflect about the ways that you can encourage your learners to be critical thinkers. And finally, similarly to point one, it is not something you can do in one lesson. It should be an ongoing and continuous part of a course. So you cannot teach it in one go. It should be incorporated during your course, during your curriculum, at all points where it can be relevant and helpful. Here is an example of how some language teachers like to think about criticality. So we have Bloom's taxonomy. So Bloom came up with the 6 orders of thinking. At the bottom, we have what he referred to as the low order cognitive cognitions. So that's remembering something, then understanding it, then applying it. So I remember that something happened on this day, I understand what happened, and then I'm able to use that information to apply to something else. Pretty simple. I remember present perfect, I know what present perfect means, and I can use it in a few different situations. The top 3 are referred to as higher order cognitions. And this is where criticality comes into play. Next, I'm going to show you some types of questions we can ask our learners in order to encourage analysis, evaluation, and the highest level of thinking referred to as creation or creating here. First, we're going to look at analysis. So here I'm going to give you 6 question stems that you can use in your lessons to encourage learners to analyze situations, language, or topics that come up in your class. The first, what are the pros and cons of? So they have to decide the advantages and disadvantages. How would you explain? So thinking about taking something and explaining it in your own words and also coming up with a rationale or justification for it. How is this connected to this? So they have to analyze this part and then understand how those pieces connect to this. What's the main idea behind? So understanding what the secondary and sub ideas are as opposed to the entire main idea of something. Commonly used in reading text, for example. How is something similar to something else? And finally, what ideas could justify this conclusion? So you might give learners an idea or an opinion or a conclusion and get them to analyze all the different things that could justify that opinion. Next, we're going to look at evaluate. How would you feel if? Give learners a situation and ask them to examine how they might feel in that situation. How would you deal with? A common topic of this is giving students a problem and asking them to think about how they would solve or deal with that issue? Is there a better solution? Getting learners to evaluate existing solutions to problems. Climate change issues are a popular topic for this type of question. Rank things in order of importance, giving learners some typical inventions and asking them to rank them in order of importance to society versus personal importance. How might this be viewed from a different perspective? This is a very popular type of task. You give learners an article on something, get them to read it, establish and analyze the opinion of the writer, and then get them to think about how that writer's perspective has influenced their opinion. How might someone with a different perspective view that opinion? Finally, what would be the consequences of giving them an action and getting them to discuss what could happen or what might happen if that took place? Finally, we're going to look at create. This is the highest order of thinking according to Bloom's taxonomy and requires learners to synthesize and mix everything they've learned together to create something new. Asking learners to come up with a way to do something. How might you solve this problem? How might you create something to deal with an issue? How would you improve something? Giving them a policy or a strategy, asking them to improve on it. How could you solve? How would you test? Asking learners, how would you test someone's language ability? How would you test someone's speaking? What would happen if? Giving learners an idea of what do you think would happen if this situation occurred, creating their own possible set of consequences. And finally, can you design something? Typical tasks for this might include designing their own house, designing a political campaign. Okay. When you're doing critical thinking in lessons, here are some very important things that you need to think about including. So make sure you give learners the chance to analyze and evaluate information. Just giving them the opportunity to remember and understand it is not enough. So for example, you might give learners scripts or dialogues and ask them to analyze the language being used and evaluate if they understand why the speaker used that particular language. Could anything else have been used to express the same meaning? You allow them to analyze and evaluate that rather than simply telling them what tense is there, what's the rule behind that tense. Incorporate the questions we've looked at into feedback and group work. So rather than just asking learners to check answers with their pairs, you might ask them some of the questions I've shown you in previous slides and discuss those, which will give them more criticality in their pair work. Give students space to make critical decisions rather than telling them the answers. Often as teachers, it's very tempting to hold students' hands through lessons, but critical thinking cannot occur unless learners are given the space to make these decisions by themselves. Pushing the responsibility and onus onto the learner and helping them when needed, but only when really needed, not when just they're stuck. Asking learners to reflect on different perspectives. So as we said, if you give them a text or an opinion in any context, asking them, how do you think this perspective affects that issue? How might another perspective change that? So nationality, how might an English person perceive this issue versus an American, or instead of American, English versus their own nationality? How might someone who works in finance view that issue versus someone who works in healthcare? How is someone who is pro view this problem versus someone who is anti view this problem? Use contexts that are relevant to students' lives. It's very difficult to introduce criticality into the classroom if the context you're providing students are not relatable It's easier for students to analyze and evaluate situations that are familiar and relevant to them. So initially, it's really important that you make sure that the topics and contexts you're using to teach criticality are relatable to students. And give students space to reflect on their experiences and what they have learned. A very common way of doing this is at the end of the week, you can ask students to talk to their partner and discuss which language they have chosen to write down and try to remember. Which language did they decide they weren't interested in? As they discuss, they have to justify and evaluate the different language they have been given, and also talk about how that language relates to their own personal experiences. This is a very vital tool for critical thinking. And finally, give more creative assignments. So instead of typical gap fills, ask students to do more analysis, evaluation, and creation in their assignments. Don't ask them to do a gap fill filling in the tenses for the story. Ask them to write their own story. Don't ask learners to just spell words or remember vocabulary. Ask them to rank that vocabulary or the items listed that you have taught them. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I hope this session has been useful and given you some good ideas for how you can introduce criticality and critical thinking into the classroom. As we've said in the session, it's an ongoing basis, and I hope that you've had some useful thoughts here today on how you might introduce this and encourage it in your learners. Thank you very much.